Hello, Champagne here with another match of Legacy from the MTG Paper Legacy Discord group. Today I am playing Bant Omni-Tell, a combo deck based on using Show and Tell to get Omniscience out, and once you get Omniscience out, you can use Cunning Wish to get shared summons, which will be able to find you Emrakul and Grizzlebrand, which pretty much wins you the game on the spot, because not only is it 22 power plus an extra turn right away, Grizzlebrand gives you a steady supply of cards to stock up on things like Force of Will and Veil of Summer. The deck also plays a pretty decent fair game because it has stuff like Icefang Coatl and Veil of Summer, which are really nice 2-for-1s against decks like Delver and the Snoko decks. Unfortunately, the fair side of the deck doesn't really come into play today because my opponent, TheSurge, is on Ad Nauseam Tendrils, a Storm deck which usually seeks to win the game by turn 3 or turn 4, which doesn't really allow for the value of Icefang Coatl and Astrolabe to come into play. Game 1 I'm on the play, which is really good in this matchup because it's all about racing. My opponent leads off with a Duress, and I get to reveal my hand, which is 2 Show and Tell, an Omniscience, a Cunning Wish, a land, and a Grizzlebrand, which is a really powerful hand. Turn 3 combo lined up right there already with the Show and Tell, Omniscience, and Cunning Wish. And my opponent has me discard a Show and Tell, and with the idea that they'll use another discard spell to get the other Show and Tell later, stranding the expensive spells in my hand. On my second turn of the game, I just pass it over to my opponent. My opponent plays a Tropical Island and plays a Ponder. Looks at their top 3, and fortunately for me, they shuffle it away and take the blind draw. And they pass it over to me. I play a land, and this is where I make a critical error in the first game. Because I saw a Ponder and snow-covered swamp, I thought my opponent was on a Sultai Snoko deck, and I wanted to insulate my hand against Force of Will because I only had one Show and Tell left. So instead of just trying to jam the combo, I just hold up Cunning Wish for Veil of Summer, which would let me cast my Show and Tell with Veil of Summer backup if I draw a land on the next turn. This was a pretty critical error, and I shouldn't have made it because my opponent played a Duress, and the only decks that play Duress are the proactive combo decks, and so I should have internalized that and just gone for the combo and won on the spot right here, and I just passed the turn. Opponent plays a land, and then they play a Preordain, and they scry 2, and they put the 2 directly on top, which is not a good sign for me. They draw, and I get punished when my opponent has a second Duress. And then I reveal my hand of Cunning Wish, Show and Tell, Astrolabe, Grizzlebrand, and Omniscience. And at this point, my opponent is free just to take the Show and Tell, and my hand is sort of dead in the water. I use this opportunity to fetch up a land, and I cast Cunning Wish for Veil of Summer, which should insulate me from future discard spells. On turn, I draw. I play Astrolabe. I pass the turn. My opponent just passes the turn, and I cast the Icefang Coatl to get some pressure on. I untap and I draw. I play a land, and I play my third Astrolabe to draw another card and get in for that 1 damage. Here, my opponent casts a Thoughtseize, but I get my 2-for-1 with Veil of Summer. And then they fetch up, and they cast Wishclaw Talisman, which I'm pretty obligated to Force of Will, seeing as I shouldn't let the Storm deck just tutor away. And here, I cast a Brainstorm. At this point, I'm just looking for another Show and Tell so that I can still combo off. I miss on the Brainstorm, so I fetch away with this Misty Rainforest, grabbing a Tundra, and I get another look at it with Ponder. Unfortunately, the Ponder doesn't yield Show and Tell, so I just shuffle away and take a draw. I crack in for 1, and I pass the turn. Here my opponent casts an Infernal Tutor for Dark Ritual, which means I know they're going to have a lot of mana in hand, and my time is very limited. My opponent casts a Dark Ritual, and at this point I figured that my best shot is to use my second Cunning Wish and tutor up a Surgical Extraction, and Surgical Extraction the Infernal Tutor in the graveyard. And the reason I do this is because if I exile the Infernal Tutor and get the one out of his hand, I should be able to strand his hand with a bunch of mana and no payoff. Unfortunately, his hand is 2 Dark Rituals, an Infernal Tutor, a Lotus Petal, and a Tendrils of Agony, which means they already have enough mana and spells to go off with and win on this turn, especially because I've already cast 2 spells for them, increasing the storm count by 2, and I scoop it up. I should also note that there were some technical errors made in this match where the 2 Cunning Wishes that I cast should have been exiled instead of being put into the graveyard. It can be relevant in this matchup because of Emrakul shuffling the graveyard back in when she gets put into the graveyard. Anyway, on to sideboarding. In this matchup, I decided that the best approach would be to take out the 2 Teferi Time Ravelers and take out the 2 Icefang Coatls. The reason I took these cards out was because they don't really do anything in the matchup. Icefang Coatl is just too slow to present any sort of threat, and Storm doesn't really run any creatures that I'd really want to kill off. And Teferi is primarily there to stop counter magic and to sort of bounce creatures like Hooting Mandrills. But Storm doesn't really run any creatures, and the interaction they run is discard, which Teferi doesn't really stop. The cards that I brought in were the 2 Jorayul, which is a nice little 2-drop that I can play early, and then all my cantrips like Ponder, Brainstorm, and Preordains, and Arcane's Astrolabes turn into 2/2 cats, which should really put the pressure and allow me to leverage cards like Force of Will just a little bit better, and make them go off when they might not want to. I also brought in Surgical Extraction because sometimes they'll cast like a Dark Ritual early and you can like tag it with the Surgical and they won't have enough mana to go off with. And I brought in the 4th Veil of Summer primarily because of all the discard spells that I know they already have in the main deck. Essentially, I am just trading out 4 cards that do nothing for 2 sources of pressure, the Veil of Summer, which is really good, and a Surgical Extraction, which isn't particularly good, but at least it can do something in this matchup, and that's better than spending 3 mana to draw a card. And in game 2, I'm on the play, and I cast a Ponder, and look at the top 3. My Ponder decision is actually interesting, because in the top 3 cards, I have an Omniscience, a Cunning Wish, and a City of Traders, and I have 2 Show and Tell in hand. So essentially, I am able to stack it so that the City of Traders is on top, followed by the Omniscience, followed by the Cunning Wish, which will ensure that I will be able to cast a turn 2 Show and Tell for Omniscience, even if my opponent has a discard spell. And my opponent does have the discard spell, and I reveal my hand of City of Traders, Show and Tell, Misty, and Surgical. They take the Surgical because there's no point in taking the Show and Tell if I have 2 of them. I draw my card for the turn. I cast a Show and Tell for Omniscience, and then I pass. This is still a risky spot for me because the Storm is very able to go off with 3 lands, and I have no way of stopping it. But luckily, my opponent just passes the turn, and I am able to cast a Cunning Wish for Third Summons to get Emrakul and Griselbrand and close out this game in a very quick one. Game 3 is going to be tough because I'm on the draw, and I might not be able to raise what my opponent has going on. My opponent leads the way with a Thoughtseize, and I reveal my hand that's mostly just interaction and a Brainstorm with some force protection. And my opponent elects to take the Veil Summer, which makes sense if they plan on using more discard. I just play my Flowstrand and I pass a turn. And I do follow up with another discard spell, and this time I'm able to fetch up and cast Brainstorm to insulate my hand against the duress. And then in my Brainstorm, there is a Show and Tell and another Cunning Wish along with an Icefang Coatl. So what I'm actually able to do is reveal a hand of just 2 Cunning Wish and an Icefang Coatl, forcing my opponent to take the Cunning Wish and protecting my counterspell and my combo piece on the top of my deck. I play my island and I pass a turn. And my opponent follows up with a third discard spell. And here I reveal Cunning Wish, Force of Will, and Ice Fang. And my opponent does elect to take the Cunning Wish, which I think makes sense as it's a combo piece. I just play Prismatic Vista and I pass a turn. My opponent plays Tropical Island and passes. And because I was able to protect a show and tell, I actually am able to get this Emrakul that I top deck into play. My opponent puts an LED into play, which I think they should have actually held in their hand so they can get more storm count on their following turn. I draw for the turn, and they hit me with a fourth discard spell. I can't really force this as there's no point because I still won't have any protection, so I just let it resolve. My opponent's then able to cast a Brainstorm with 5 mana still left over, so there's still a high potential for them to be able to combo off. And my opponent reveals to me the cards they were mulling over in their Brainstorm. Normally in this Brainstorm, you just put the Infernal Tutor back and the Veil of Summer, and have Lotus Spell and Infernal Tutor. Unfortunately for them, this only leaves them with 6 mana, so they're not able to play the Infernal Tutor and crack the LED to get Ad Nauseam, because that takes 7 mana. So even though this Force of Will never actually ended up countering anything, it did still win me the game because my opponent knew about it, and thus they had to Thoughtseize on this turn, which deprived them of the mana they actually needed to go off. And I'm sure if they were able to hit the Ad Nauseam, they were going to be able to storm off and win because they still had a pretty healthy life total of 13, and they still had a lane drop to make for the turn.